The gunshot echoed through the dusty streets of Oatman, Arizona territory as Victoria Oleander pressed herself against the rough wooden wall of the Silver Nugget Saloon, her heart pounding against her ribs. It wasn't the first time she'd heard gunfire since arriving in this mining town 3 weeks ago, but the proximity sent cold fear through her veins as she clutched the small sack of discarded food scraps to her chest. The year was 1882, and Victoria had learned quickly that the promise of a new life in the West often came wrapped in hardship. She had arrived with only the clothes on her back and a locket containing a faded photograph of her parents, both gone from typhoid fever back in Philadelphia. The teaching position she'd been promised had vanished like morning mist under the harsh Arizona sun when the school's funding had fallen through. Cautiously, Victoria peered around the corner of the saloon toward the street. 2 men stood facing each other, one clutching his bleeding arm. The sheriff was already pushing his way through the gathering crowd. Victoria ducked back behind the building, returning to her task of gathering scraps from the saloon's refuse. Her stomach growled painfully, reminding her that pride was a luxury she could no longer afford. "That's no place for a lady," a deep voice said from behind her. Victoria spun around, nearly dropping her precious sack of food. A tall man stood watching her, his face partially shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat. He wasn't dressed like the miners or the gamblers who frequented the saloon. His clothes were trail-worn but clean, dark trousers tucked into boots that had seen many miles, a blue cotton shirt beneath a leather vest, and a bandana loosely tied around his neck. "I'm not doing any harm," Victoria said, lifting her chin despite the shame burning her cheeks. "The cook said I could take what they throw out." The man stepped closer, and Victoria could see his face properly now. He was younger than she'd first thought, perhaps 30, with a weathered face that spoke of years under the sun and eyes the color of the sky after a storm. His expression wasn't mocking or pitying, just observing. "Name's Matthew Stanton," he said, touching the brim of his hat. "I've got a steak waiting inside that's too big for one person. Would be a kindness if you'd help me eat it." Victoria hesitated, her fingers tightening on her sack of scraps. "I don't accept charity, Mr. Stanton." A slight smile crossed his face, crinkling the corners of his eyes. "It's not charity to share a meal with a fellow traveler, and I reckon you could tell me what's worth seeing in this town while we eat." The rumbling in Victoria's stomach grew louder, as if arguing in Matthew's favor. She hadn't eaten a proper meal in days, subsisting on cast-off bread and vegetables. Still, she'd been raised with propriety, even if circumstances had forced her to abandon it. "I hardly know the town myself," she admitted. "I've only been here 3 weeks." "That's 3 weeks more than me," Matthew replied. "Arrived this morning. So you'd be doing me a favor, Miss Oleander. Victoria Oleander." "Miss Oleander," he repeated, as if testing how her name felt on his tongue. "What do you say to that steak? It'll go to waste otherwise." Victoria glanced down at the sack in her hands, then back at the man's open, honest face. There was something in his steady gaze that made her want to trust him, despite all the lessons life had taught her about strange men and their offers. "Very well, Mr. Stanton," she said finally. "I accept your invitation." Matthew's smile broadened as he gestured toward the saloon's front entrance. "After you, Miss Oleander." Victoria hesitated again. Perhaps the side door would be better. She smoothed her threadbare dress, painfully aware of her appearance. Her once fine blue dress was clean but mended in multiple places, and her dark hair was simply braided rather than styled properly. "I'm not dressed for the main room." Understanding crossed Matthew's face. Without comment, he offered his arm and led her to the side entrance that connected directly to the dining area, separate from the main saloon where men drank and gambled. The smell of cooking meat hit Victoria as they entered, and her stomach clenched painfully in anticipation. The dining room was modest, but clean, with 6 tables spread across a plank floor. Only 2 other tables were occupied, one by an older couple who barely glanced up as they entered, and another by a man studying papers spread before him. Matthew guided Victoria to a corner table and pulled out a chair for her. "Charlie," he called to the man behind the small bar, "bring that steak over here and another plate. And some of that cornbread I saw coming out of the kitchen." Charlie nodded, eyeing Victoria with curiosity but not unkindness. "So," Matthew said, settling into his own chair, "what brings a lady like yourself to Oatman?" Victoria's hands twisted in her lap. "A teaching position, or what I thought would be one. The letter said they needed someone for the school, but when I arrived—" She shrugged slightly. "The mine scaled back operations, families moved away, and there weren't enough children to warrant a school after all." Matthew's expression turned sympathetic. "And no way back east?" "No." Victoria's answer was simple but contained volumes. No money, no family, no options. Their conversation paused as Charlie brought over a large platter with a steak, potatoes, and green beans, along with a basket of cornbread and 2 plates. The smell made Victoria lightheaded. "Will there be anything else, Mr. Stanton?" Charlie asked. "2 coffees," Matthew replied, "and whatever pie you've got back there." After Charlie left, Matthew transferred half the steak to Victoria's plate, along with generous portions of the sides. "Please," he said, noticing her hesitation, "eat while it's hot." Victoria didn't need to be told twice. She tried to eat slowly, to maintain some dignity. But it had been so long since she'd had proper meat that she found herself cutting the next piece before she'd finished chewing the first. Matthew ate more slowly, watching her with something like tenderness in his eyes. "Been a while since you've had a real meal, I take it." Victoria paused, embarrassed. "I'm sorry." "It's not very ladylike." "Nothing to apologize for," Matthew interrupted gently. "I've been hungry before. Know what it's like." Something in his tone made Victoria believe him. She took a sip of coffee, savoring the warmth and bitterness. "And what brings you to Oatman, Mr. Stanton? You don't look like a miner or a gambler." "Just passing through," he said. "I've got a small cattle operation north of here. Came to arrange some business with the butcher and general store." "A rancher, then," Victoria said. "On a modest scale," Matthew confirmed. 20 acres and about 60 head of cattle. Nothing like the big spreads in Texas, but it's mine." There was quiet pride in his voice. "Got a good spring on the property. Makes all the difference out here." As they ate, Matthew told her about his small ranch, the cabin he'd built himself, the challenges of raising cattle in the arid landscape, the satisfaction of working his own land. Victoria found herself relaxing, drawn in by his unpretentious manner and the easy way he spoke. There was nothing demanding in his attention, just a genuine interest that she hadn't experienced in a long time. "And you, Miss Oleander?" Matthew asked as Charlie cleared their plates and brought 2 slices of apple pie. "What will you do now?" Victoria stared down at her pie. It was the question she'd been asking herself for weeks. "I'm not certain," she admitted. "I've been taking in mending and laundry, but it's barely enough for a room at Mrs. Harper's boarding house. I thought perhaps I might find work in Prescott or Phoenix, but—" She didn't need to finish the sentence. The cost of stagecoach passage was far beyond her means. Matthew nodded thoughtfully, taking a bite of his pie. "Good people in this town?" "Some," Victoria said. "Mrs. Harper has been kind enough to let me stay despite being behind on rent, and Reverend Miller and his wife have helped where they can." She didn't mention the others, the men with wandering hands who thought a woman alone was available for the taking, or the women who looked through her as if poverty were contagious. They finished their pie in companionable silence. When it came time to leave, Victoria found herself reluctant to part ways with this quiet, steady man who had shown her such unexpected kindness. "Thank you for the meal, Mr. Stanton," she said formally as they stepped outside into the gathering dusk. "It was most generous of you." Matthew looked down at her, his expression thoughtful. "Miss Oleander, I hope you won't take this amiss, but I have a proposition for you." Victoria stiffened slightly, wariness returning. She'd heard propositions before. Seeing her reaction, Matthew quickly added, "A proper business arrangement. My housekeeper, Mrs. Whitaker, left last month to care for her daughter's new baby in Flagstaff. I've been managing on my own, but truth be told, the place is becoming something of a disaster." He smiled ruefully. "I need someone to cook and keep house, and you need employment. I can offer room, board, and fair wages." Victoria stared at him, searching for any hint of deception. "That's very kind, but your ranch is remote," you said. "It wouldn't be proper." Mrs. Whitaker's cabin is still there, small but comfortable, about 50 yards from the main house," Matthew explained. "Your reputation would be intact. And I can give you references. Sheriff Davis knows me, as does Reverend Miller." He paused. "It's honest work, Miss Oleander. Nothing more intended." Victoria considered his offer. She had few options left in Oatman, and the prospect of steady employment and a place to live was tempting. Yet caution held her back. "May I have until tomorrow to consider and to speak with Reverend Miller?" "Of course," Matthew nodded. "I'll be at the general store in the morning, settling my business. Find me there when you've decided." He touched his hat brim again. "Good evening, Miss Oleander." Victoria watched him walk away, her thoughts in turmoil. His offer seemed sincere, but she had learned that appearances could be deceiving. Still, as she made her way back to Mrs. Harper's boarding house, her stomach full for the first time in weeks, she couldn't help feeling that perhaps fortune had finally smiled upon her. The next morning, Victoria rose early and made her way to the Millers' modest home beside the small church. Mrs. Miller welcomed her warmly, offering tea despite the early hour. "Matthew Stanton," Reverend Miller said when Victoria explained her visit. "A good man. Keeps to himself mostly, but never misses Sunday services when he's in town." "He's offering me a position as his housekeeper," Victoria explained. "But I wanted to be certain." Mrs. Miller patted her hand. "You're wise to ask, my dear. So many young women rush into situations without proper consideration." She exchanged glances with her husband. "We've known Matthew for 3 years now. He helped rebuild the church after the fire, wouldn't take a penny for his labor. His wife passed during childbirth. Before he came here, the baby too, I believe." "He was married?" Victoria hadn't expected this information. Reverend Miller nodded. "It changed him, from what I understand. He doesn't speak of it, but Sheriff Davis knew him before. Says he was more outgoing once, quick to laugh." "I've never heard a word against his character," Mrs. Miller added. "If he's offered you a position with separate living quarters, I believe you could accept with a clear conscience." Victoria thanked them for their counsel and made her way to the general store, her decision made. The prospect of leaving Oatman brought mixed feelings, relief to escape her desperate circumstances, but uncertainty about what awaited her at Matthew Stanton's ranch. She found Matthew loading supplies into a wagon outside the general store. He straightened when he saw her approaching, his expression carefully neutral. "Mr. Stanton," Victoria said, coming directly to the point, "I would like to accept your offer of employment if it still stands." The smile that broke across his face transformed his features, making him appear younger. "It does indeed, Miss Oleander. I'm pleased you'll be joining me." He gestured to the wagon. "I can take you to collect your belongings, and we can be on our way by noon." An hour later, Victoria's few possessions were packed in a small trunk and loaded onto Matthew's wagon. She said goodbye to Mrs. Harper, promising to send money for the remaining rent as soon as she was able. The older woman hugged her tightly. "You be careful out there," she whispered. "Mr. Stanton seems decent enough, but you're all alone with him. Keep your wits about you." "I will," Victoria promised, touched by the landlady's concern. The journey to Matthew's ranch took most of the day, following a winding trail that led away from Oatman into more rugged country. Matthew pointed out landmarks as they traveled: a distinctive rock formation, a creek that flowed year-round, the distant mountains that marked the boundary of his land. Victoria found herself stealing glances at her new employer as he handled the team of horses with easy confidence. In the daylight, she could see the silver threading through his light brown hair at the temples, and the fine lines around his eyes that spoke of squinting into the sun. He wasn't conventionally handsome, but there was a strength and steadiness to him that she found reassuring. "There it is," Matthew said eventually, pointing ahead as they crested a small rise. "Stanton Ranch." Victoria leaned forward to get a better view. The ranch was nestled in a shallow valley with hills rising behind it. A creek wound through the property, its banks lined with cottonwood trees. The main house was larger than she had expected, a solid log structure with a covered porch across the front. Nearby stood a barn, corrals, and several smaller outbuildings. To the right of the main house, about 50 yards away, as Matthew had said, was a smaller cabin. "It's lovely," Victoria said sincerely, taking in the peaceful setting. Matthew looked pleased. "It's taken work to get it this far, but there's still plenty to do." He clicked to the horses, and they started down the slope toward the ranch. As they approached, Victoria noticed a large dog bounding toward the wagon, barking enthusiastically. Matthew reined in the horses and called out, "Settle down, Scout!" The dog, a mix of shepherd and something larger, immediately stopped barking and sat, though his tail continued to sweep the ground excitedly. "Don't worry, he's friendly," Matthew assured Victoria, as he set the brake and jumped down from the wagon. He came around to help her down, his hands strong and steady at her waist. Victoria was acutely aware of how close they were for that brief moment before her feet touched the ground. Scout approached cautiously, sniffing at Victoria's skirts. She held out her hand, and after a thorough inspection, the dog pushed his head under it for a scratch. "He approves," Matthew said with a smile. "That's a good sign. Come, let me show you to your cabin." The small cabin was basic but clean, with a main room that served as both kitchen and sitting area, and a small bedroom beyond. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, and the windows, though small, let in plenty of light. Simple furniture, a table with 2 chairs, a rocking chair by the fireplace, a dresser in the bedroom filled the space without crowding it. "Mrs. Whitaker left it in good order," Matthew explained. "There's linens in the chest, firewood stacked outside. The pump at the back draws from the same well as the main house." Victoria walked slowly around the space, taking it in. After the cramped room at Mrs. Harper's, it seemed spacious and private. "It's perfect," she said softly. "I'll bring your trunk in," Matthew said. "Take your time settling in. I usually have supper around 6, but today's been long. Whenever you're ready is fine." Left alone, Victoria unpacked her few belongings, arranging them carefully in the dresser drawers. She splashed water on her face from the basin and changed into her second dress, equally worn but clean. As she pinned her hair back up, she caught sight of herself in the small mirror above the dresser. The woman looking back at her seemed different somehow, still thin from weeks of insufficient food, still wearing clothes that had seen better days, but there was something in her eyes, a spark of hope that hadn't been there that morning. When she made her way to the main house later, Victoria found Matthew in the kitchen, attempting to fry bacon. The room was filled with smoke, and he was coughing as he tried to salvage the blackened meat. "Mr. Stanton," Victoria said, trying not to smile. "Perhaps I should start my duties immediately?" Matthew looked up, relief washing over his face. "Miss Oleander, I would be eternally grateful." Victoria took the cast iron pan from him and assessed the situation. The bacon was beyond saving, but there were eggs, bread, and a pot of beans that looked more promising. "Why don't you open some windows while I see what I can do?" Within half an hour, Victoria had prepared a simple but satisfying meal. They ate at the kitchen table, as Matthew explained that he rarely used the dining room when it was just him. "This is a fine start to our arrangement," Matthew said appreciatively as he finished his food. "I haven't eaten this well since Mrs. Whitaker left." "I'm glad it meets with your approval," Victoria replied. "Tomorrow I can prepare something more substantial once I've taken stock of your pantry." "About that," Matthew said, looking slightly embarrassed. "I'm afraid supplies are running low. I meant to get more in Oatman, but with offering you the position and all," he trailed off. "I can ride back tomorrow if needed." Victoria shook her head. "Let me see what's available first. I'm quite good at making do with what's at hand." It had been a necessary skill these past weeks. As they cleared the dishes together, Matthew outlined her duties: cooking, cleaning, laundry, tending the kitchen garden, and general upkeep of the house. The work seemed reasonable for the wages he offered, which were indeed fair. "I rise early to tend to the cattle," Matthew explained. "Breakfast at dawn, if that's not too much to ask. Lunch is often in the field, but supper around sundown. That won't be a problem, Victoria assured him. She had always been an early riser. As darkness fell, Matthew lit a lantern to walk Victoria back to her cabin. Scout padded alongside them, occasionally rushing off to investigate a sound in the darkness before returning. "Thank you again for accepting the position," Matthew said as they reached her door. "It's good to have someone else on the property." Victoria understood what he didn't say, that it had been lonely here for him. "Thank you for offering it," she replied. "Good night, Mr. Stanton." "Matthew," he said, "out here. There's little need for such formality." Victoria hesitated, then nodded. "Good night, Matthew. And you may call me Victoria, if you wish." His smile was visible even in the dim lantern light. "Good night, Victoria. Sleep well." The days quickly established a rhythm. Victoria rose before dawn to light the stove and prepare breakfast. Matthew would already be outside, seeing to the initial morning chores, and would come in stomping dust from his boots just as she was putting food on the table. They ate breakfast together mostly in companionable silence, Matthew not being particularly talkative in the early hours. Victoria would pack him lunch bread, cheese, sometimes cold meat or beans, which he would take with him as he rode out to check on the cattle or work on repairs around the property. The daytime hours were filled with Victoria's chores, sweeping, dusting, laundry, tending to the chickens that provided eggs, and working in the kitchen garden that had become somewhat overgrown in Mrs. Whitaker's absence. The work was physical but satisfying, so different from the desperate scramble for existence she'd experienced in Oatman. Evenings were when they truly began to know each other. Over supper, they would talk hesitantly at first, then with growing ease. Matthew told her about growing up in Missouri, about coming west after the war with nothing but determination and the horse he rode, how he'd worked as a cowhand on larger ranches, saving every penny until he could claim this land under the Homestead Act 5 years ago. Victoria shared her own story, her childhood in Philadelphia, as the daughter of a bookkeeper, the education that had prepared her to be a teacher, the devastating typhoid epidemic that had taken both her parents within a week of each other, how she'd answered the advertisement for a teacher in the Arizona Territory, selling most of her possessions to pay for the journey. What neither of them discussed were the more painful chapters of their lives. Matthew never mentioned his wife or the child they had lost, and Victoria didn't speak of the desperate weeks in Oatman before he found her, or the indignities she had suffered. Yet, as the days turned into weeks, Victoria found herself watching Matthew when he wasn't aware, the careful way he handled tools, the gentleness he showed to animals, the quiet concentration on his face as he read one of the few books he owned in the evenings. She told herself it was natural to be curious about the man she worked for, but in her heart, she knew it was more than that. For his part, Matthew began finding reasons to be near the house during the day, a fence that needed fixing close by, tools that needed organizing in the barn, a wagon wheel that required attention. Victoria would bring him water or coffee, and they would talk briefly before returning to their tasks. Each time his eyes seemed to linger on her a moment longer than necessary. It was during her 3rd week at the ranch that Victoria discovered the piano. She had been cleaning the rarely used front parlor when she noticed a shape beneath a heavy cloth cover. Pulling it back revealed a small upright piano, dusty but seemingly intact. Victoria's fingers hovered over the keys. She had played since childhood, but not since leaving Philadelphia. Hesitantly, she pressed a key. The note rang out, slightly flat but clear. Unable to resist, she sat on the bench and began to play a simple melody. So absorbed was she in the music that Victoria didn't hear Matthew enter the house. She only realized he was there when she finished the piece and heard a soft sound from the doorway. Turning, she saw him standing there, his expression unreadable. "I'm sorry," Victoria said quickly, rising from the bench. "I should have asked before." "Please don't apologize," Matthew interrupted. "It's been too long since there was music in this house." He stepped closer, looking at the piano with a mixture of emotions crossing his face. "It was my wife's, Catherine's. She loved to play." It was the first time he had mentioned his wife by name. Victoria remained silent, sensing that he was working through something important. "After she died, I couldn't bear to hear it," Matthew continued quietly. "But just now, when I heard you playing..." He looked directly at Victoria. "It didn't hurt the way I expected. It felt right somehow." Victoria felt the weight of his words, understanding that he was sharing something deeply personal. "Would you prefer I not play it?" Matthew shook his head. "No, I think it's time the piano was played again. Catherine would have liked that." He smiled slightly. "She would have liked you, Victoria." The moment hung between them, intimate and charged with unspoken feelings. Then Scout barked outside, breaking the spell. "I should get back to the north pasture," Matthew said, his voice returning to its normal tone. "Got a section of fence down?" "Of course," Victoria replied. "Supper will be ready at the usual time." After he left, Victoria sat back down at the piano, her fingers resting lightly on the keys. Something had shifted between them, though she couldn't quite define what it was. The change became more apparent in the days that followed. Matthew began telling stories about Catherine during their evening conversations, how they had met at a church social in Missouri, her passion for music, her excitement about moving west to start their own ranch. It seemed that speaking of her was no longer the burden it had once been. Victoria, in turn, found herself sharing more of her own hopes and disappointments. She told him about the fiancé who had broken their engagement after her parents died. Unwilling to marry a woman with no dowry or connections, about her dreams of having her own school someday, not just teaching in someone else's. "You could still have that," Matthew said one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset. The summer heat had given way to the cooler evenings of early fall, and the sky was painted in brilliant oranges and pinks. Oatman might not need a teacher, but other towns do. "Perhaps," Victoria said, though the thought of leaving the ranch leaving Matthew brought an unexpected pang. "For now, I'm content here." Matthew glanced at her, his eyes reflecting the sunset. "Are you? Truly?" Victoria met his gaze steadily. "More than I expected to be." Something passed between them then, an acknowledgement of feelings that had been growing over the weeks. Matthew's hand moved slightly toward hers where it rested on the arm of her chair, but he pulled back before making contact. "Sunday's the church social in town," he said instead. "Would you like to attend? Might be nice for you to see some new faces." "I'd like that," Victoria replied, both disappointed and relieved that the moment had passed. She wasn't ready to define what she felt for Matthew, nor to know if he shared those feelings. The journey to Oatman on Sunday morning was pleasant, the weather perfect for traveling. Victoria wore her best dress still worn but freshly pressed and had taken extra care with her hair. She told herself it was because she would be meeting people from town, but she was acutely aware of Matthew's appreciative glance when she emerged from her cabin. Matthew himself was dressed in what Victoria had come to recognize as his Sunday best dark trousers, a white shirt with no patches, and a vest that had been carefully brushed. He had trimmed his beard and slicked back his hair, and Victoria thought he looked younger, almost boyish in his neatness. The church service was well attended, with families from the surrounding ranches joining the townspeople. Reverend Miller seemed genuinely pleased to see Victoria, introducing her to several members of the congregation as Matthew Stanton's new housekeeper and our former teacher-to-be. Victoria was conscious of the curious looks directed her way throughout the service. A single woman working for a widowed rancher was bound to create gossip, despite the separate cabins and the miller's endorsement. She kept her expression pleasant but reserved, determined to give no cause for talk. After the service, tables were set up in the churchyard for the social. Women laid out covered dishes of food, while men arranged benches and chairs in the shade of the large oak tree. Children ran and played, their Sunday clothes already showing signs of grass stains and dirt. "Victoria!" Mrs. Miller approached, her round face beaming. "How wonderful to see you looking so well. Ranch life must agree with you." "It does," Victoria admitted. "I found it quite satisfying." "And how is our Matthew treating you?" Mrs. Miller asked, lowering her voice slightly. "Everything proper, I hope." "Mr. Stanton has been a perfect gentleman," Victoria assured her, feeling her cheeks warm. "I have my own cabin." and the work is exactly as he described it. Mrs. Miller patted her arm. Good, good. He's a fine man who's had his share of sorrows. It does my heart good to see him in town more often. He used to come in only when absolutely necessary. Before Victoria could respond, she felt a presence at her side and turned to see Matthew holding 2 plates of food. Mrs. Miller, he greeted the older woman with a nod. I hope you don't mind if I steal Miss Oleander away. Mrs. Davis was asking after her. Of course, Mrs. Miller said with a knowing smile that made Victoria's blush deepen. Don't let me keep you. As they walked toward the sheriff's wife, Matthew murmured, Sorry for the interruption, but you looked like you might need rescuing. Thank you, Victoria replied quietly. Mrs. Miller means well, but she's the biggest gossip in 3 counties, Matthew finished with a smile. I know. She's been trying to marry me off since Catherine passed. The mention of marriage sent Victoria's thoughts spinning in directions she wasn't prepared to explore. To cover her confusion, she accepted the plate Matthew offered and turned her attention to Mrs. Davis, a no-nonsense woman with a direct manner that Victoria found refreshing after Mrs. Miller's probing. The afternoon passed pleasantly enough, though Victoria was increasingly aware of the interested glances and whispers that followed her and Matthew. When he brought her a cup of lemonade, the conversation among a group of women nearby paused noticeably. When she laughed at something he said, Mrs. Miller nudged her friend and nodded in their direction. Perhaps we should leave soon, Victoria suggested quietly after several hours. I seem to be providing too much entertainment for the good people of Oatman. Matthew followed her gaze to where several women were openly watching them. Let them talk, he said, though he kept his voice low. We know the truth of things. But what was the truth? Victoria wondered as they rode back to the ranch later that afternoon. That she was simply Matthew's housekeeper? Or that something more was developing between them, something neither had put into words? The question lingered in her mind over the following days. Matthew seemed more attentive than before, finding small ways to show consideration, bringing her wildflowers he'd found while checking the herd, carrying water to the garden so she wouldn't have to make as many trips, fixing the loose step on her cabin's porch without being asked. For her part, Victoria found herself taking special care with the meals she prepared, remembering his preferences and preparing his favorites. She had taken to playing the piano in the evenings, and Matthew would often sit in the parlor listening, a peaceful expression on his face that tugged at her heart. It was during one such evening, about a week after the church social, that everything changed. Victoria had been playing a gentle nocturne, losing herself in the music as twilight deepened outside the windows. When she finished and looked up, she found Matthew watching her with an intensity that made her breath catch. You play beautifully, he said, his voice lower than usual. Thank you, Victoria replied, suddenly very aware of how alone they were in the house. My mother insisted on lessons from the time I was 7. Matthew rose from his chair and moved to stand beside the piano. Victoria, he said, her name like a question on his lips. Yes, she answered, her heart beginning to race. I find myself thinking about you at the oddest moments, he admitted, when I'm checking fences or moving the herd, even when I'm just sitting and should be reading. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture she'd come to recognize as a sign of nervousness. I know it's not proper. You're in my employ, and I promised you nothing untoward. Victoria's fingers trembled slightly on the piano keys. Matthew, please let me finish, he said gently. I need to say this properly. I haven't felt this way since Catherine, and even then it was different. With her, we were young. Everything happened so quickly. He paused, searching for words. With you, it's grown so naturally that I didn't realize what was happening until it was already done. Victoria stood slowly, her legs unsteady beneath her. What are you saying, Matthew? He stepped closer, close enough that she could see the flecks of gray in his blue eyes. I'm saying that I care for you, Victoria, more than as my housekeeper, more than as a friend even. His voice dropped almost to a whisper. I'm saying that I'm falling in love with you, and I don't know what to do about it. The confession hung in the air between them, changing everything. Victoria felt as though she could hardly breathe, her emotions a tangled mess of joy, fear, and uncertainty. You don't need to answer now, Matthew said quickly, misinterpreting her silence. I understand this is sudden, and if you don't feel the same way— I do, Victoria interrupted, finding her voice at last. I do feel the same way. Matthew's expression transformed, hope lighting his features. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, he raised his hand to cup her cheek. His touch was gentle, almost reverent, and Victoria leaned into it without thinking. May I kiss you? He asked, his voice rough with emotion. Victoria nodded, unable to form words. Matthew leaned down, bringing his lips to hers in a kiss that was tender and questioning at first, then deeper as she responded. His arms slipped around her waist, drawing her closer, and Victoria's hands moved to his shoulders, steadying herself against the rush of feelings coursing through her. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing unevenly. Matthew rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed as if savoring the moment. I've wanted to do that for weeks, he confessed. Victoria smiled, feeling a lightness in her chest that had been absent for too long. So have I. Matthew drew back slightly, his expression growing serious. Victoria, I need you to know this changes things. I can't have you as my housekeeper now, not like before. A cold shock went through her. Are you asking me to leave? No! Matthew's response was immediate and emphatic. God, no, I'm asking. He took a deep breath, then reached for her hands, holding them in his own. I'm asking if you would consider becoming my wife. The proposal was so unexpected that Victoria could only stare at him. Your wife? Matthew nodded, a mixture of hope and fear in his eyes. I know it's sudden, and we haven't known each other very long. If you need time to think about it, I understand. But I know what I feel, Victoria. I love you, and I want to build a life with you here. Victoria's mind raced, trying to process what was happening. Just months ago, she had been gathering scraps behind a saloon, desperate and alone. Now this good, kind man was offering her not just security, but love, a partnership, a future. You don't have to answer now, Matthew repeated, misreading her hesitation again. Take all the time you need. Victoria shook her head, a smile spreading across her face. I don't need time, Matthew. My answer is yes. The joy that bloomed on his face was answer enough that she had made the right decision. Matthew pulled her into another kiss, this one celebrating what they had just promised to each other. Later, as Matthew walked her back to her cabin, a routine that now felt entirely different, they began making plans. They would marry in the church in Oatman, with Reverend Miller officiating. The separate cabin would become a guest house, or perhaps someday, a place for children to play. The thought made Victoria blush in the darkness. At her door, Matthew kissed her once more, lingering as if reluctant to leave her. Good night, Victoria, he murmured against her lips. Sleep well. Good night, she replied, feeling as though she were floating. Inside her cabin, Victoria lit a lamp and sat on the edge of her bed, trying to absorb everything that had happened. She was going to be Matthew Stanton's wife. The ranch would be her home, not as an employee, but as its mistress. The future that had seemed so uncertain in Oatman had suddenly become clear and bright. As she prepared for bed, Victoria caught sight of herself in the small mirror. The woman who looked back at her was transformed, eyes bright, cheeks flushed with happiness, a smile playing around her lips. For the first time since her parents' deaths, she felt truly hopeful about what lay ahead. The weeks leading up to the wedding were busy but joyful. Word spread quickly through Oatman and the surrounding area that Matthew Stanton was to marry his housekeeper, causing predictable gossip. Mrs. Miller made a special trip to the ranch to express her delight and offer assistance with wedding preparations. I knew it, she declared, clasping Victoria's hands. The moment I saw you two at the social, I said to Mr. Miller, those two are meant for each other. Didn't I say that, Reverend? Reverend Miller's eyes twinkled with amusement. You did indeed, my dear. Victoria and Matthew exchanged smiles over Mrs. Miller's head. They had decided not to correct the assumption that their romance had been developing for some time. The truth that Matthew's proposal had come the same evening as their first kiss might have caused even more gossip. The wedding was set for early October, when the worst of the summer heat had passed, but before the unpredictable winter weather arrived. Victoria had only her worn blue dress to wear, a fact that troubled her more than she wanted to admit. She wanted to be beautiful for Matthew on their wedding day. Matthew, sensing her concern without her having to voice it, suggested a trip to Prescott where there were proper shops. "Consider it an early wedding gift," he said when Victoria protested the expense. "Please, Victoria, let me do this for you." The journey to Prescott took 2 days each way, but Victoria found it worthwhile when she stood in the dressmaker's shop, being fitted for a simple but elegant wedding dress of ivory silk. She also selected fabric for new everyday dresses, feeling almost decadent at spending money on herself after so many months of strict economy. During their stay in Prescott, Matthew insisted they take a room at the best hotel, separate rooms, of course, with Victoria's reputation still very much on his mind. They dined in the hotel restaurant, drawing curious glances from other patrons. Victoria knew they must make an odd pair, Matthew with his weathered rancher's face and practical clothes. She's still thin from her months of near starvation despite the good food at the ranch. "Let them look," Matthew said quietly when he noticed her discomfort. "All I see is the most beautiful woman in Arizona territory, who has somehow agreed to become my wife." His words warmed her, as they always did. This was something she was still adjusting to, being valued, being seen not for what she could provide, but for who she was. The night before their return journey, they walked through Prescott's town square after dinner. The evening was cool, stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. Matthew had been quieter than usual during dinner, and Victoria sensed there was something on his mind. "Is everything all right?" she asked as they strolled past the courthouse. Matthew nodded, then seemed to reconsider. "Mostly. There's something I've been wanting to discuss with you, but I've been putting it off." Victoria felt a flutter of anxiety. "What is it?" Matthew guided her to a bench where they could sit. "It's about children," he said after a moment. "After losing Catherine and our baby." He paused, collecting himself. "I need to be honest with you. The thought of going through that again terrifies me." Victoria took his hand, understanding now why he had seemed troubled. "Matthew, I can't promise that won't happen. No one can." "I know," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "And I want children with you, Victoria. I do. But the fear—" "We'll face it together," Victoria promised, squeezing his hand. "Whatever happens. But Matthew, you should know I want a family. I've always dreamed of having children." She looked at him steadily. "Is that something you can accept? That someday, when we're ready, we'll try despite the fear?" Matthew was silent for a long moment, his face shadowed in the gathering darkness. Finally, he nodded. "Yes. With you beside me, I think I can face anything." He lifted her hand to his lips. "Thank you for understanding." "Always," Victoria replied simply. When they returned to the ranch, preparations for the wedding accelerated. Victoria moved her few belongings from the cabin to the main house, though they had agreed she would continue to sleep in the cabin until after the ceremony. It was a concession to propriety that seemed increasingly unnecessary as the days passed, but one that Matthew insisted upon. "I want to do this right," he told her one evening as they sat on the porch after supper. "Start our marriage with everything proper and blessed." Victoria leaned her head against his shoulder, content despite the physical distance they maintained. "You're a good man, Matthew Stanton." "I'm trying to be," he replied, his arm around her shoulders. "For you." The day of the wedding dawned clear and mild, as if nature itself approved of their union. Mrs. Miller and several women from the church had arrived the previous day to help with preparations. They had transformed the ranch house with flowers and ribbons, and the yard had been swept and tidied, with tables set up for the modest reception to follow the ceremony. Victoria dressed in her cabin with Mrs. Miller's assistance, her stomach fluttering with nerves and excitement. The ivory silk dress fit perfectly, highlighting her figure, which had filled out somewhat during her months at the ranch. Her dark hair was arranged in a simple but elegant style, adorned with small white flowers. "You look beautiful, my dear," Mrs. Miller said, wiping away a tear. "Absolutely beautiful." Victoria smiled, too emotional for words. She thought of her parents, wishing they could be here to see this day. Somehow, though, she felt their presence, their approval of the man she had chosen and the life she was about to begin. The ceremony itself was simple but deeply moving. Reverend Miller conducted the service in the front yard of the ranch house with the backdrop of the land Matthew had worked so hard to build, the land that would now be their home together. Neighbors and townspeople from Oatman had made the journey to witness the union, filling the yard with friendly faces. When Matthew saw Victoria for the first time in her wedding dress, the expression on his face was worth every penny spent and every mile traveled to Prescott. His eyes filled with tears, and he mouthed, "Beautiful," as she walked toward him on Sheriff Davis's arm, the older man having offered to give her away. The vows they exchanged were traditional, but spoken with such feeling that many in attendance were moved to tears. When Reverend Miller pronounced them husband and wife, Matthew's kiss was tender and reverent, mindful of their audience, but leaving no doubt of his feelings. The celebration afterward was joyous, with music provided by several neighbors who had brought instruments, abundant food prepared by the churchwomen, and dancing that continued until sunset. Victoria found herself passed from partner to partner for the group dances, while Matthew watched with a smile that never left his face. When the last guests departed, heading back to town or to neighboring ranches to spend the night, Victoria and Matthew stood on the porch of their home, truly theirs now, together. "Mrs. Stanton," Matthew said softly, testing the name as he had once tested hers when they first met. Victoria's heart swelled with happiness. "Mr. Stanton," she replied, matching his tone. With a swift movement that made her gasp, Matthew swept her into his arms. "I believe it's tradition for a man to carry his bride across the threshold," he said, his eyes dark with promise as he carried her into their home. The days and weeks that followed were a time of adjustment and discovery. Victoria learned the rhythms of being a wife rather than a housekeeper, though many of her tasks remained the same. The difference was in the partnership they were building, decisions made together, plans for the ranch's future, discussed over meals, the shared intimacy of their bed at night. Matthew, too, was adjusting. After years of solitude and grief, having someone to share his life with brought changes both practical and emotional. He found himself looking forward to returning to the house each day, knowing Victoria would be there. He began to open up more about Catherine and the child they had lost, finding that sharing the memories with Victoria somehow made them easier to bear. As autumn deepened into winter, the ranch settled into a quieter routine. The cattle required less attention, allowing Matthew to spend more time on projects closer to home, reinforcing the barn for the coming snows, repairing tools, planning for spring planting. Victoria used the quieter days to make the house more of a home, sewing curtains from fabric bought in Prescott, organizing Matthew's haphazard collection of books, cooking more elaborate meals now that she had time to experiment. Their first Christmas as a married couple was simple but meaningful. They rode into Oatman for the church service, then returned home to exchange modest gifts: a new hat Victoria had ordered for Matthew through the general store, a silver locket Matthew had purchased secretly during their Prescott trip. "Open it," he urged as Victoria admired the delicate engraving on the surface. Inside was a tiny portrait of Matthew that he had done by a traveling photographer who had passed through Oatman the month before. Victoria was speechless, touching the image with gentle fingers. "So I'm always with you," Matthew explained, watching her reaction anxiously. "Do you like it?" Victoria's answer was a kiss that left no doubt of her feelings. Later, as they sat before the fire, Matthew holding Victoria in his arms, she felt a contentment she had never expected to find after the desperate days in Oatman. "I was thinking about the day we met," she said, watching the flames dance. "Behind the saloon." Matthew's arms tightened around her. "I remember. You were so proud even then." "I was starving," Victoria corrected with a small smile, but too stubborn to admit it. "I knew you were special from that first moment," Matthew said, pressing a kiss to her hair. I just didn't know how much you would change my life." Victoria turned in his embrace to face him. "You saved me, Matthew." He shook his head. "No, we saved each other." As winter turned to spring, Victoria began to suspect what the increasing fatigue and morning sickness meant. She kept her suspicions to herself at first, remembering Matthew's fear. When she was certain, she chose a quiet evening to tell him, after they had finished supper and were sitting on the porch watching the sunset. "Matthew," she began, her heart racing, "I have something to tell you." He turned to her, his expression curious. "What is it?" Victoria took a deep breath. "I'm going to have a baby." "Our baby." Matthew's face went still, a complex mix of emotions crossing his features: joy, fear, wonder, and back to fear again. "You're sure?" Victoria nodded. "As sure as I can be. It would be due in late October, I think." Matthew was silent for a long moment, processing the news. Then, to Victoria's surprise, he knelt before her chair and laid his head in her lap, his shoulders shaking. She realized he was crying, quiet, controlled sobs that he tried to muffle against her skirts. "Matthew," she whispered, stroking his hair. "It's all right." He looked up at her, his face wet with tears, but his eyes bright with a fierce joy. "I'm terrified," he admitted, "but I'm also happier than I've been in a very long time." Victoria felt her own tears starting. "So am I." Both terrified and happy. Matthew placed a gentle hand on her still flat stomach. "We'll face it together, just like you said." "Together?" Victoria agreed, covering his hand with her own. The months of pregnancy brought changes to both Victoria and the ranch. Matthew insisted on hiring a young man from town to help with the more strenuous tasks, freeing Victoria to rest more as her body changed. He became protective, sometimes excessively so, until Victoria had to gently remind him that women had been having babies since the beginning of time. "Not my wife," Matthew would reply stubbornly. "Not carrying my child." As Victoria's belly grew, so did Matthew's anxiety mixed with anticipation. He spent evenings with his hand on her stomach, feeling the baby's movements with wonder. He read every book he could find about childbirth and infant care, ordering them from as far away as San Francisco. Victoria arranged for Mrs. Miller and the town's midwife, Mrs. Thornton, to attend the birth. As her time grew nearer, Mrs. Miller moved into the guest cabin to be on hand when needed. Matthew had initially wanted to send Victoria to Phoenix, where there was a proper doctor, but she had refused. "I want our baby to be born here, in our home," she insisted. "Mrs. Thornton has delivered hundreds of babies safely." The labor began on a clear October morning, almost exactly when Victoria had predicted. Matthew paced anxiously outside the bedroom as Mrs. Miller and Mrs. Thornton attended Victoria inside. The hours stretched on, the women occasionally emerging to fetch hot water or clean linens, offering him reassurances that everything was progressing normally. As evening approached, Victoria's cries grew more frequent and intense. Matthew, unable to bear it any longer, burst into the bedroom despite Mrs. Thornton's previous instructions to stay out. "I need to be with her," he said firmly, moving to Victoria's side and taking her hand. "I'm not leaving." Mrs. Thornton looked as though she might argue, then nodded sharply. "Stay at the head of the bed and keep out of my way." Victoria's face, pale and drawn with pain, lit up at the sight of Matthew. "You're here," she gasped between contractions. "Wild horses couldn't keep me away," he promised, wiping her forehead with a damp cloth. The next 2 hours were the longest of Matthew's life as he witnessed Victoria's strength and endurance through the increasingly difficult labor. When Mrs. Thornton finally announced that it was time to push, he held Victoria's hand so tightly he feared he might break it, whispering encouragement and love as she fought to bring their child into the world. The cry, when it came, was strong and indignant. Matthew felt his heart stop, then restart at double pace as Mrs. Thornton lifted a squirming, red-faced infant. "You have a son, Mr. Stanton," she announced, her usually stern face softening with a smile. "A fine, healthy boy." Matthew couldn't speak, couldn't move as the midwife quickly cleaned the baby, wrapped him in a blanket, and placed him in Victoria's arms. Victoria looked down at their son with exhausted wonder, then up at Matthew with tears streaming down her face. "He's perfect," she whispered. Matthew found his voice at last, though it was rough with emotion. "Just like his mother." He reached out a trembling finger to touch his son's tiny hand. The baby's fingers instinctively closed around it, and Matthew felt a surge of love so powerful it nearly overwhelmed him. "What shall we call him?" Victoria asked. Matthew had been thinking about this for months, but had kept his thoughts to himself, wanting to see their child first. Now, looking at the baby's dark hair, so like Victoria's and strong features, he knew. "Joseph," he said, "after my father, Joseph William Stanton." Victoria smiled tiredly. "William was my father's name." "I know," Matthew replied. "It seems fitting." Mrs. Miller and Mrs. Thornton discreetly left the room, giving the new family a moment of privacy. Matthew sat carefully on the edge of the bed, his arm around Victoria's shoulders, both of them gazing down at the miracle they had created together. "Thank you," Matthew said softly, pressing a kiss to Victoria's temple. "For our son, for everything." Victoria leaned against him, exhausted but radiantly happy. "I love you, Matthew." "And I love you," he replied. "Both of you." The years that followed brought changes and growth to the Stanton ranch and family. Joseph grew into a sturdy, curious boy with his father's blue eyes and his mother's dark hair. When he was 2, a sister joined the family, Catherine Rose, named for both Matthew's first wife and Victoria's mother. Unlike Joseph's difficult birth, Catherine's arrival was swift and relatively easy, much to everyone's relief. The ranch prospered under Matthew and Victoria's joint management. They added more land when a neighboring property became available, expanded the herd, and built a proper schoolhouse where Victoria taught not only their own children, but those from nearby ranches as well. Her dream of having her own school had come true in a way she had never anticipated. On the 10th anniversary of their wedding, Matthew surprised Victoria with a trip to San Francisco, their first real vacation since their marriage. Mrs. Miller, now a widow, but still energetic despite her 70 years, stayed at the ranch to care for 8-year-old Joseph and 6-year-old Catherine. In the privacy of their hotel room after a day of exploring the vibrant city, Matthew held Victoria close, marveling at how the years had only deepened his love for her. "Do you ever think about that day behind the saloon?" he asked, tracing the curve of her cheek with gentle fingers. "How different our lives might have been if I hadn't gone out back for some air." Victoria smiled, remembering her pride and desperation, the unexpected kindness of the quiet rancher who had offered her a meal. "I think about it often," she admitted, "how close I came to refusing your invitation." "I'm glad you didn't," Matthew said, kissing her softly. "Though I would have kept asking until you said yes." "Would you now?" Victoria teased, her eyes bright with love and happiness. "Absolutely," Matthew confirmed. "Some things are meant to be, Victoria. We're one of them." As they stood together looking out at the San Francisco Bay, Victoria thought about the journey that had brought them here from desperate poverty to a life rich with love, family, and purpose. The scraps she had been gathering behind that saloon so long ago had been transformed into a feast more abundant than she could have imagined. "I love you, Matthew Stanton," she said, leaning into his embrace. "Thank you for offering me a place at your table." Matthew's arms tightened around her. "Thank you for accepting," he replied simply, "and for making it our table." Together they watched the sunset paint the water in shades of gold and pink, grateful for the twist of fate that had brought them together behind a dusty saloon in Oatman, and for the love that had transformed both their lives.